All right, let's go to the New Orleans Saints. To me, one of the more disappointing teams in 2023, not because I think they were a great team. They had one of the easiest schedules in the NFL. Really, the NFC South had all easy schedules, essentially. And the Saints, I think, they had what looked like the most stable quarterback position going into the season last year before we knew Baker Mayfield was going to break out. And they finished 9-8. It was the same record as the Bucs. They lost the tiebreaker. They don't win the division, but it feels like the Saints should have won the division last year. And they're in an interesting spot here, Sam, because they're the team you always like to reference. They max out the credit card, right? They keep pushing the credit card balance into year after year, and it's like, when's it going to come back to bite? And I think you're slowly seeing the depth on the Saints roster get a little bit more depleted. They've been one of the better drafting teams in the NFL over the last 10, 12 years. I think that's slowed down just a touch. It's year 2 of Derek Carr. What are you looking for the Saints here and their big stories heading into 24?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing for me is Derek Carr, I think, had a slow start to his career in New Orleans. But by the second half of the year, Derek Carr was actually playing some pretty good football. So does that continue heading into year 2? Like, did he just take some time to acclimatize and get used to a new offense and new receivers and all those kinds of things? And now Derek Carr is going to be who we thought he was going to be when they signed him? Or is he just that inconsistent and you can't necessarily rely on him playing at a very high level for, half the season? If they can get him playing at that level and he picks up where he left off, then I think the Saints are back in the hunt as, a genuine division winner, even with Atlanta having Kirk Cousins now, and even with Tampa Bay, having discovered Baker Mayfield, if he backs that up. But if Derek Carr is just that inconsistent, that's the concern. So, I think he should theoretically be capable of playing at a very high level. They've got receivers to play with, even if that group has had some turnover and maybe been depleted. Chris Olave, I think, is a really good player. Rashid Shaheed is an outstanding deep threat and gimmick type of receiver. He can take, screens, all those kinds of things. You've got some young guys now in A.T. Perry, who made a really nice play in preseason, his first week. Bob Means, the low-drafted guy this year, rookie. And then it's a case of what is that offensive line going to look like? Because that group has completely fallen apart over the last few years.
Before I want to touch on the line and those playmakers you talked about, but the other factor here is they're going with the Friends of Kyle strategy when it comes to offensive coordinator. They're bringing in Clint Kubiak, who was the passing game coordinator for the Niners last year. Of course, Gary Kubiak and all it's the West Coast tree. It's where's the tree start? Is it Mike Shanahan? Is it is it Gary Kubiak? But it's Friends of Kyle. This has worked recently. The last pass game coordinator that went from the Niners to becoming an OC was Bobby Slowick, turning the Texans around with C.J. Stroud. This feels like it's a lot to overcome, though, because of the offensive line. And what you and I have said, sometimes it seems like that scheme can overcome the bad on-paper offensive line, the offensive line that looks like, I don't know if they can do a whole lot, but they scheme it up really well. They use angles really well in the run game. They protect the quarterback through the scheme, through getting receivers open quickly. But this one could be too much to overcome here, Sam. There's a lot of moving parts here. Ryan Ramczyk has been one of the best tackles in the league since 2017, since he was a first-round draft pick. He's injured. He's out at right tackle. They're moving former first-round pick Trevor Penning from left tackle to right tackle. Penning has been banged up and underwhelmed when he's been on the field. They drafted Talise Fuanga in the first round out of Oregon State. He played right tackle at Oregon State. He's moving to the left side. And then your guards are Lucas Patrick, Cesar Ruiz, most likely. Neither of those guys has been great in the majority of their career. They're good at center with Eric McCoy. So you're literally talking about 4 out of 5 positions that are questions. And when I like to look at an offensive line, the O-lines that I say are good, the ones where I say 4 out of 5 I feel good about, right? That are not question marks. And if you have one question mark, all right, that's fine. We could probably work around that. But we're talking 4 out of 5 question marks up front for the Saints.
Yeah, you hear the 80-20 rule all the time, right? In business and all kinds of things. That's the offensive line is the 80-20 rule as well. If 80% of your line is good and 20% is bad, you've got one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. If 80% is bad and 20% is good, you might have the worst offensive line in the NFL.
You can't 20-80 the offensive line. It's the old adage in business, you cannot 20-80 the offensive line. So I've got concerns there. And Derek Carr, he's not the best when he's got he's under heat all the time. No quarterback really is. I don't think he's the type of guy that overcomes poor pass blocking or even poor run blocking that puts them into 3rd and longs all the time. It's going to be tough to overcome up front.
Yeah, it is. It's been, that group has really eroded, and they've tried to repair it. There's some like 3 first-round picks are on that offensive line right now. 2 of them haven't worked out, and that's part of the problem. Like, Cesar Ruiz hasn't been a good player on the interior, and then Trevor Penning so far has been injured and a disaster. And then obviously Fuaga, the rookie, we haven't seen from him yet. But that's a problem, right? Anytime you spend multiple high draft picks at a position and it simply doesn't work out, you are behind the 8 ball, particularly if you were relying on those positions and actually contributing right away. And the Saints have been that style of team. Like, they have been the type that relies on their drafting and targets players and earmarks them for significant roles with the confidence that they're good at this. They can draft players, they can identify talent, and that'll fix a position. And when you swing and miss multiple times at that, you put yourself in a problem spot, and that's basically what's happened to them on the offensive line.
And I would say Derek Carr is similar to that Kirk Cousins situation, right? We've seen years where Derek Carr was a top 10 caliber quarterback, produced like a top 10 quarterback, and other years where he was closer to 20. And he's somewhere in the 10 to 20 range, closer to 20 probably at this point in his career. But he could give you top 10 quarterback play. He's got to play better in the red zone. Remember, that was a key story for the Saints last year. Playmaker-wise, you mentioned some of the guys. I think Chris Olave, excellent player. Rashid Shaheed's ability to get behind the defense is just unbelievable and extremely consistent. Juwan Johnson has been a little up and down at tight end, but he's shown the ability to stretch the seam. And they're talking up Taysom Hill, even though he's, almost our age, Sam, almost in his 40s. Taysom Hill, we're going to line him up all over the place. He's going to be awesome again. So, Taysom Hill aside, I think the playmakers are legit for the Saints. The O-line's just got to hold up a little bit better. And then I think defensively, kind of similar questions. They had one of the better defensive lines in the NFL just a few years ago. Lose a Trey Hendrickson, you lose Marcus Davenport, Cameron Jordan gets a little bit older. You're trying to replace all those guys with several top draft picks, and the jury's still out on a whole bunch of those guys. The Peyton Turners of the world, the Brian Brzezis of the world, Isaiah Foskey's of the world. All these guys, 1st and 2nd round picks. They need those guys to step up and get the Saints defensive line from really one of the worst the last couple of years back to where they were when they were the best team in the NFC South for a couple of years.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. Like, the Saints had a run where they were one of the best drafting teams in the NFL, and they were at a ridiculous strike rate throughout the draft, which is still, a relative crapshoot. But they were really good at this, and that's when the Saints were at their best. Their talent was really good. They were able to restock with the draft. They brought in a bunch of fixes. And then the last couple of years, they've sort of hit the downside of that. They've hit the bad end of variance, and the wheels have fallen off. And just a ton of these high draft picks that they spent on both sides of the ball simply haven't worked out yet. And we hit the ones in the offensive line, but Peyton Turner was a high draft pick who hasn't contributed really at all. Brian Brzezis, okay, the jury's still very much out on him, but he didn't look an impact playmaker year one. They need him to be significantly better this season. Foskey, as you mentioned, has not made a real impact yet. Like, these are players that they need to show up in a big way. Otherwise, that defensive line is extremely depleted. And, okay, Chase Young coming in is an interesting gamble to try and potentially fix that on a relatively sort of buy low proposition, roll of the dice. Cameron Jordan is still a good player despite his age. Carl Granderson is useful, but the big X factor, or the thing that's going to determine how good this defensive line is at least 2 of those 3 high draft picks that we talked about before, Brzezis and Foskey. Like, are those guys actually going to take a significant step forward, or are they going to be more underachieving high draft picks that become like let down areas?
I've been bullish on the Saints the last couple of years, even last year, right? I thought that they could have done more. 9-8 isn't a disastrous season. I thought they had 10 or 11 wins in them just because of the schedule. They should have a favorable schedule again this year. If we're talking best case scenario, I think all of these question marks that we're talking about the youth movement on the offensive line, relying on young players at tackle, the defensive line relying on these younger players to step up. Like, all that needs to come good, essentially. And then you're talking about the Saints, I think, competing with the Falcons for the division, and it's the same expectation, right? Maybe win the division and, sneak a playoff win if you get the higher end of Carr throughout the season.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best case scenario for the Saints is probably similar to that of the Falcons, right? It's you win the division, you maybe win a playoff game or two. I don't really see it including being a truly elite team, Final Four, Super Bowl type of thing. I don't really think they have that in them. But if things do go right for them, they've got enough talent that they could still win that division when nobody should be dominant, and potentially beat a couple of teams in the playoffs.
Worst case scenario, I think it's. I hope we're not skewing too negative here for the Saints in our discussion, but I think it's the worst roster that they've had in the last 9 or 10 years. Since maybe the middle of the Drew Brees era. Maybe we'll say more question marks now than they've ever had, especially on both lines. At the same time, they've had that ability to play some lockdown defense and step up at times and get the most out of their players. But worst case scenario, I think the O-line is a disaster. I think that affects Derek Carr, and you get the low end of Carr. Maybe you're talking about Spencer Rattler or Jake Haener taking over at some point just to see what you have. Thinking about moving on from Carr at some point during the season. And the defense, all the talent that they've lost over the last few years just comes back to bite. I mean, I think those are all possibilities this year.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like their worst case scenario, though, is still pretty high. It's still a reasonably high floor. They're too good. There's too much talent in this roster for them to be a total and utter catastrophe outside of the standard injury caveats that is true for everybody. So I think like the worst case scenario for them realistically is they're not better than last year. The teams around them have potentially gotten a bit better, certainly in Atlanta's case, and they just sort of struggle to playoff missing mediocrity, right? And they're in that 6-7 win type of range where they're outside of a top end draft pick, but they're never really threatening the postseason.
The one thing I want to add before I want to talk about a key position or player, there is a lot of potential at corner. Marshawn Lattimore getting a little bit older, but I think he's still capable when he's out there. Paulson Adebo coming off a really good year. The ageless wonder of Demario Davis in the middle of that defense. They just re-signed Pete Werner. I mean, they do have talent on that side of the ball to affect opposing quarterbacks and make life difficult for them. I just think they need the D-line to step up as we talk key position group. To me, it's the defensive line. Who is it going to be? Do they get the best of Chase Young? They took the 1-year flyer on Chase Young. I'm always willing to take that chance because I think he still has the opportunity to get back to where he was earlier in his career before the injuries. One of the Peyton Turners or Brian Brzee of the world affecting the quarterback. One of those guys needs to step up. And then key position group-wise, the two tackles, not only Penning trying to prove himself, but moving from the left side to the right side. Fuanga moving from the right side to the left side as a rookie. A lot of moving parts and question marks there. But if those guys, settle in, that helps a ton and might offset what I thought would be the worst-case scenario where the offensive line is really struggling.
Yeah, I think the entire offensive line for me is the key unit. Every position is almost every position is a question mark, like you said, 80% of it. The 80% of it, I think, we just need to figure out what that's going to be. Fuanga is a really talented guy. That guy absolutely moves people once he makes contact. He's pretty solid in pass protection, but he is flipping sides. Trevor Penning has not been good in the NFL, but he's like the classic old school road grading right tackle, which doesn't really exist in today's NFL because right tackle, left tackle, it's basically become the same thing. So if he couldn't hang on the left side, there's no real indication that he's going to be able to do it on the right side because it's not a hiding place anymore, right? So if he's just not able to play tackle, he might be your guard. And
it's
the
almost
interiors,
it's just incurring more risk because you have two guys flipping sides. So they're both trying to get comfortable at positions that are of equal importance.
But the solution now to a guy like Trevor Penning, who's, powerful, strong, but is really struggling from a technique standpoint, the solution to that now might not be flip him from left tackle to right tackle. It might be flip him from left tackle to left guard, right? That might be the solution to those types of players. But either way, it's a real concern and a risk for the Saints right now.